So, second half today, thinking about optimal planting pattern, which is in your booklet, and then I'm going to go on to show you slides to illustrate a lot of the techniques that I've been talking about up to now. So part of that is going to be what I call soil sculpture, and that is consciously trying to co-opt art in the service of something practical. But yeah, it's very much following on from what we thought about with the 8 stages of plant development. And the starting point is really that all plants want to grow roots out in every direction in a circle. And just taking that principle and following it through gives this patterning. Other things that we'll talk about in soil sculpture is the mounding of the soil, the deep drilling and trenching. Basically, this is trying to copy nature, and my favourite example would be the floodplains like the delta in Egypt, where once a year, every year, the Nile floods and it pours over the land, and it also deposits a load of organic matter on the soil and essentially earths the soil up by another couple of inches. So it's bringing in nutrients and it's making the soil a bit deeper and depositing organic matter around the plants, essentially a form of mulching. But we can do the same with soil and move the soil around to actually help the plants at different stages. I'll show you that in pictures in a bit. But just on the optimal planting sheet, again, it's trying to think, we can see what's going on above ground, the stems and the leaves and the flowers and that, but trying to invert the plant and imagine what's going on in the root system. And the pictures on the 8 stages show a developing root system which gets more complex up to the point of flowering and fruiting. So if that's the starting point, that gives us a different approach from the old standard recommendations, which were you sow a row of everything and then you thin out and remove plants to leave one every so many inches. This really fits in whenever I'm transplanting plants that I've raised in pots or in trays and then planting them out. This is the pattern that I try to aim for. And yeah, one point here is if you're trying to optimise rather than maximise, optimise the total weight of crop that you want from a given space. If you grow fewer, larger specimen exhibition vegetables, larger sized, they'll actually take up a lot more space, and you won't get as much crop as if you try and grow lots of smaller, medium sized things. And part of that is if you had a plant that got damaged or a complete crop failure of one thing, you'd lose that space. Whereas if you've got lots of individual plants and you lose one or two, you've only lost a small proportion of your bed. So that's if slugs come along and nibble your cabbages after you've planted them out. And just going through the diagram here, the first point is it's the radius from the plant's growing point outwards and how big the root system is going to get at maturity. The second is exactly the same pattern, but this time measuring the distance from one plant's growing point to the next. And that's how far apart each plant is planted. So when I instruct people to plant something, I can just say with beetroots they need about 4 inches apart from plant to plant. With cabbages they'll need more like 18 inches apart. With some things like artichokes or cardoons, they need about 3 foot separate from each other. But it's trying to think, how big's the plant going to grow above ground at maturity, and how far are the roots going to spread before they start competing with the next door plant. So that's the thinking, and that gives us point 3, this pattern. It's basically a hexagonal pattern, and if we think about a beehive, the honeycomb, is set in a hexagonal pattern, whether it's the bees that make it or whether you start with a pre-cast former for the bees to follow on with. That is the pattern to fit most circular things into a given area. There is a question like where the number 3 is printed on that diagram. Well, there's a bit of a gap there at the edge of the bed. But rather than see that as a problem and wasted space, that's an opportunity to stick a little herb in at the edge of the bed, to use that half a space at the edge of the bed and get the benefits of the companion planting along with the optimal planting. The fourth part of this diagram is just illustrating if I want to weed a crop, well, if it's in rows I go up and down the rows, but if it's in this pattern I can go up and down the rows and in between them in 2 directions, and it really makes it a lot easier to do hoeing and weeding if by just passing the tool up and down in between the plants in 3 directions. If I just do that in 3 directions, I've got rid of most of the weeds almost without thinking. A lot easier weeding. And the fifth part of the diagram, like the pictures with cabbages and lettuces growing together, that's imagining one larger plant or longer lived plant with a smaller plant planted in between. And all this makes most sense when we're actually thinking about perennials and fruit. And if you were starting an orchard, instead of planting your fruit trees in a line and at right angles to each other, where there'd be a gap in the middle of a square where they don't root until right at the end, if you plant out your orchard in this pattern, then it's going to be more efficient use of space in the longer term. And the longer term for an orchard could be another 100 years. So rather than having 100 years of gaps, you can have 100 years of using whatever space you've got available most effectively. And you can't quite see it precisely, but when you look at pictures of, say, rainforests, again, it's not absolutely precise, but they will have separated themselves out, and they will be roughly in this honeycomb optimal planting pattern, just by naturally evolving, that one plant will push this far, and then the next one, if it's too close, the next one won't be able to grow, and it'll die back. And you'll end up with something that's approximately this optimal planting pattern. And let's just have a go at... so this is maximising use of space, soil, water and sunlight. You get the maximum number of plants into a given area, and it's most efficient in terms of time, space and money, minimising the bare soil. And one thing is, if you think about pests and diseases in relation to this, if you grew a row and your little seedlings come up and they're actually all touching each other throughout the life of the crop, then pests can just walk along that row and lay eggs or eat along that row. Whereas if the small plants are planted out in this pattern, they only meet each other and touch with the leaves when they get to full size. So all through the early part of the plant's life, pests won't be able to walk from one plant to the other as easily. And let's just see, I think I've explained enough about that. That'll do for an explanation. So this is something that is a core kind of underpinning, it's in my subconscious almost. And whenever I'm planting anything out, large or small, I'll tend to plant in this pattern. Does it make sense as a kind of idea? Okay. Any questions? No? The only uncertainty is, again, it's how big a different plant's going to grow, and you might give more than enough space to each plant, in which case there'll be this gap, this unused soil, which you could put an intercrop into, you could plant something else into. But you can vary this according to how much space you've got available, and also the shape of your beds. Sometimes we've got odd-shaped beds, and you still try and follow this pattern, even if it meant having them in kind of isosceles triangles rather than equilateral triangles. We're trying to give equal space to each one, but if your bed is a strange shape, you can still squeeze a few extras in, as long as you keep planting in a triangular relationship, which builds up into a diamond pattern and eventually a honeycomb. And I'll just illustrate that. If I'm taking on a bed, let's use any table, but I'm imagining a line across the bed and planting my first set of transplants across that line, just in a line. And the next ones I'm looking to plant in the next line but in a triangle, so I can get them a bit closer than if it was just rows. And then by the time I get to the third and fourth row, I can look back and see the lines cutting across the bed roughly at 45 degrees and actually just follow that. So it makes itself up. Once you've got the first couple of rows in, then carry on planting in triangles, and you build diamonds, and then you end up with a honeycomb pattern.
So much about the orientations of north, south, east and west?
Not so much, because especially when they're young plants, they'll get light all around them, so it doesn't matter so much as when we're doing rows. Right, can we have some more lights off, Mick? Try and find these middle ones, or just turn them all off. See if it's working today. I've lost my mouse. So, sowing large seeds, each one into a single pot. Those are squash seeds, I think. And again, part of this is thinking about a system. And in this case, these plastic trays, I can get them free. They're just given away at greengrocers. And it's a bit of a compromise, but I buy in these plastic pots, 1,000 or several thousand at a time. Before that, I used to recycle yogurt pots and things. I still do that whenever I can. But just for convenience, that number of pots, 20 pots, fits in really nicely into a tray. And if I'm doing thousands of plants each year, I have to have some kind of system. So that's a hand-based system. Here's lots of different brassicas. So this will be about midsummer. These are kales to plant out in the middle of the summer that will then grow bigger in the autumn and go through the winter. So again, each different variety is in a different tray. Got about a dozen different types of kale. And then back to, we were thinking about raised beds. Part of this is a bit of a recap of what we've done so far. This is a double raised beds, so it's about 2 foot high with sleepers. So there's almost no bending involved in terms of raking the soil to a tilth. This is actually spreading fertiliser on one of those beds on an onion crop. And this is green manure rye coming up. And you can actually see the lines where we've raked the rye into the soil in the autumn in August. And that will be September or October when it's just germinating. But those plants will each tiller, they'll flesh out and have several shoots on them and give a nice covering to that bed. So I call this green manure grazing rye. I describe it as a duvet for raised beds. That's one of my little jokes. Sorry, shut up now. So back to, this is drilling. And then this is going to be a carrot bed. So I've already forked the bed several times, made sure it's weed free. It's had concentrates put into it, but not bulky organic matter, because that would make the carrots fork. So I know that I've got a good depth of really fine soil for sowing onto. And then I'm shaping the drills. These are about 3 inches wide, 3 inches deep. And that is quite deep. Depending on your soil, some soils will fall in more. But over the course of the life of the plant, I'm expecting to constantly earth up in about half a dozen different stages. Each earthing up is a form of weeding. And as the plant gets bigger and taller in the row, then I can earth it up more. And eventually, the plants end up, this dip becomes a mound around the crop. And what is a mound, or top of the drill at the moment, that's pushed all sideways up around the crop, which keeps it under the soil. And in the case of carrots, the more soil there is on top of the root, the harder it is for the carrot fly to smell that there's carrots and come along and nibble them. So it's another help with carrot fly. That's the profile from low down, just showing you quite wide, quite deep, about as wide as I can get. And the space between the drills is imagining how far the roots of the carrots are going to grow sideways. Later on, I'll have to thin the carrots if I want bigger carrots, or sow thinly, so that they've all got a bit of space going along the row, so each individual carrot plant can get growing. And that's sowing beetroots not so deep in the soil, but again, that's covering up. We can still see where the drill was, therefore we know where to water. And rather than marking and putting a line in and leaving it in, it's just leaving it obvious so that there's little labels at the end of the row. Anybody can work out the dip in the soil along the drill is where you want to water the little seedlings. This is a bit of an exaggerated version of the same thing. This is one of the autistic groups, and in this case we've done drills a foot wide and about 6 inches deep, So these people have very limited motor skills, and this allows them to just be given some peas, chuck them in roughly the right direction, and they fall into the row, so they actually manage to sow them. So it's compensating for a bit of disability there.
So don't use with like spades or rakes or...
Adaptive tools. You can get extra handles on things, and that does help. Yeah, but yeah, your techniques being really crucial, as well as functional tools for that. So there's the carrots that have germinated in the first lot of drills. Those have already been scored with a hoe and slightly earthed up, even at that stage. So very young. But carrots almost seem to encourage weeds to germinate in the soil around them. I don't know what it is. Again, it's maybe this root secretions. So that's the first earthing up. And you can see from now on, I want to water not directly at the crop, but from now on, I want to water either side of the crop. And that means I'm not going to disturb them if I water too heavily. And that's encouraging the little root systems to grow sideways in the row. At some point, I'll need to thin these and get rid of excess. So there's not enough seeds there. There's about the right number there, but there's too many in the middle there. So I'll have to actually pull some out and throw them away. And that is another side to this. It's killing plants is an absolutely crucial part of growing plants. So if I let them all grow, I'll get hundreds of tiny, hardly worth eating little carrots. If I get rid of, in this case, about 2/3 of them, then I'll end up with a few nice bigger carrots, but good to eat. So you can't be too sentimental about it. Sometimes you have to just brutally get rid of them. This is a picture of the mole where it's come up into a green manure of a Greek cress in this case. But that's my little lead into, similarly, this is a nice variegated pepper, again growing in a circle but in a pot this time. So the pot is actually acting as a warming mechanism, as a technique for keeping not just the plant but the root system warmer, because the sun will hit the side of the black pot and therefore the whole of the soil will be about 10 degrees warmer than if it was in a bed of soil or outdoors. And a little bit of planting out, that's planting out tomatoes. I'll show you another picture of that in a bit. And similar thing, each onion here, they've been transplanted out of a seed tray, onions or leeks possibly, but they're centred and firmed in, so there's a little dip around each little seedling. And then when we need to do watering, rather than having to water the whole bed, we're just specifically watering each individual plant, and if we water roughly in the right place, the water will end up at the root of the onion. So it's a lot less water involved and more precise kind of watering going on there. And we're planting out pak choys, and it's similar. Each plant is firmed in, which creates a moat around the plant. The stem is still supported on a little mound to hold the stem up. So it's a kind of, a Motte and Bailey, a castle and its moat kind of pattern. And there you can see the optimal planting pattern fitted into that bed. We've still got spaces at the edge we could plant or allow herbs to grow. But using those two techniques, the circle for planting and then spacing them out in the optimal planting pattern, so we get the maximum number of plants and growth out of that before they start competing with each other. This is a similar arrangement. The sprout plants in this case are planted out as the main crop, and these little red tinged lettuces have been planted at the interspace, the space point in the middle of the triangle that separates those three sprout plants. So the sprout plants are going to grow on, they'll grow happily because they're not competing with the lettuce. By the time the lettuces are eaten, those sprouts will be big enough that their roots will actually take over and use up the space where the lettuce has been grown. So you get two crops where you would only have one. And similar, this is a squash that's planted. It's early in the year, there might still be a frost, so it's covered in fleece and pinned down, but all this extra soil around, it would take 3 or 4 months for the squash to grow big enough to cover up all this soil, which it eventually will do. So in the meanwhile, I've put broadcast rocket seed in, and that can grow up, and I can crop that as a edible green manure, and that gives me another crop before the squash grows big enough. And a couple of techniques going on here. This is early potatoes in a polytunnel, and the individual potato plants have been planted into the optimal pattern. And I did this about 3 weeks ago in my polytunnel, planted them an inch or two below the soil surface, because there was still a chance of frost even in the polytunnel maybe a month ago. And yeah, at this very moment, they've established, and the shoots have developed, and they're just breaking through the soil surface right now in my polytunnel. If we get a hard frost, I'm going to have to put soil on top of them so they don't get frosted. But each dip, again, for watering in a polytunnel especially, water is precious, hand watering, we're doing all the work. And after I've planted the potatoes, in this case, I've got some leaf mould, which is darker than the soil. And the leaf mould goes on top of the potatoes to get that more insulation, more of the sun's light warming the soil up. So that's leaf mould as a mulch on top of the potatoes. That'll also keep them weed free, and essentially it's mulching even before they've started growing. And at the back I've got individual lettuces and mustards planted out, and then early carrots and beetroots in rows here. So with carrots and beetroots, the root crops, we don't really want to transplant if we can help it, because when we transplant we're disturbing the root that might damage it, and therefore we'd get forking and not a good root. So if they can be sown direct into drills for the root crops, that's preferable. And a combination of both, again, this is rows of French beans. They're going to grow tall eventually, interplanted with sweet corn. So there's enough space. The sweet corn are planted individually, and the French beans have been sown direct into a row rather than transplanted. And that's because I reckon I can get French or runner beans to germinate in the soil outdoors. I'd leave it another week or two, but in the next couple of weeks could contemplate sowing them in the next month. Whereas the sweet corn, I don't think they germinate outside. They've been raised indoors to get them started, give them enough warmth to start them off, and then transplanted out to catch up. There is a method, it's called the Three Sisters, and it relates back to American Indian culture, where they were on the move, they were migratory, and they'd grow 3 crops, squash, beans and corn, which can all grow in about 3 or 4 months really quickly. So they could stay for half a year in one place and start a garden and grow a crop, and then move to another place and do the same, but they'd take the seeds of the beans and the squash and the sweet corn with them, and they grow quite well together. The most accomplished growers manage to get their sweet corn big enough, and then they grow their beans up the sweet corn, using them as a support. But whenever I've tried it, I can't get it quite right, but I do know people who can do that. Here's a different method. Again, we've defined across this bed, just scored little lines about 6 or 8 inches apart. Now going along with a bit of doweling, just the end of a tool, end of a hoe, and pressing holes down into the soil. This is for transplanting leeks. And with leeks, the best bit is what's called the shaft, the white bit, which is usually going below ground. And the deeper that you can get them in the holes, the longer the shaft is going to be, and the more eating you're going to get off your leeks, and the more impressive they are. Here's a nice illustration, same optimal planting pattern, and this is actually with onions and shallots that are growing through the winter, and the snow has actually melted around where the plants are growing. So just having the little plant there, part of it's shed a bit of snow, but there's a little bit of warmth, just enough. This snow has been down for a few days, but it just gives a nice illustration of that optimal planting pattern with the lines going diagonally either way. Slightly different subject now. This is making up potting mixes, which I'll do next week. So this is adding vermiculite to leaf mould and maybe a bit of fertiliser. And other techniques, again, more illustration of this next week. This is creating rosemary cuttings. Perfect time of year to get your rosemary. Some of it's starting to be in flower. You strip off the lower leaves off the stem, then you push that stem into a pot, cover it with a little plastic bag, put it in a saucer so it's watered from below, and within a couple of months those little cuttings will form a root, and then we can take them out and pot them on and multiply something like rosemary. And this is actually, it's actually a loganberry plant, which has, the end has been buried in a pot in the first week of August, and at that point in the year it will form into a new root system and a new plant. That's called tip layering. So layering, you layer the plant near the soil. In this case you bury the tip in the soil, and it actually converts the tip into a root in about a couple of months, well, within a month actually, and we've got a nice root system established there. Then a few, just illustrating the process of growing the peas up. These peas, they're about 6 inches tall, and by pushing another couple of inches of soil up around them, that means they'll stand up for another week or two before we need to support them. And then they're getting as big as you can possibly get them, so that's a second earthing up. After that we'll have to put the string on. So the string's going on around and just above the peas so that they clamber up, around the outside of them just below where they're growing, and then crossed above where they are now, so that when they reach up they'll find some string and they can clamber up. And essentially we're growing that row almost as a single plant or a single organism, in one sense, that they're all holding each other up. So as long as I can support enough of the peas, the rest will cling on to the others and they'll all get to be big enough. Bit behind on the string in there, but yeah, necessary to support them. This is the other end of the green manure. So this is the Hungarian grazing rye, and this is what I'd describe as a duvet effect. So if you compare it to the previous picture where it was just individual little shoots, each one of those shoots has formed several shoots and multiplied and thickened up, and now that's perfect stage, ready to dig in, and again before it starts to go to flower and form a stem. And that at this time of year the soil is more active in the spring and the autumn, therefore when we chop and wilt the green manures and then dig them in, they're digested by the microbes in spring and autumn quite quickly. In summer and winter the microbes aren't so active because it's either dry or cold, and therefore it might take a bit longer for the green manure to actually get digested and broken down into the soil. So the first thing is chop and chop them off to separate the root and the shoot, and that will then allow the leaf to wilt. So leave it to wilt for a couple of days on the surface and then turn it in. If you turn it in straight green, it takes longer than if you leave it to wilt first and then turn it in. But within a week, yeah, that could be a seed bed. And the bit you can't see here is the texturing effect of the rye, but every little bit of soil to a depth of about nearly a foot is interpenetrated by all these fibrous roots, and then when they die off it leaves a lovely crumbly texture in the soil. So that's Hungarian grazing rye. This is mustards again, just used as a green manure as I've shown you in the previous picture. That's a apricot tree in the south facing wall at Unston, and in front of that these are actually field beans. So we know broad beans, these are a smaller version of field beans, and they would have been a staple crop back in the Middle Ages when we had a genuine peasantry or whatever. But these are just flowering, so it'd be time to chop them off and dig them back in, or compost them maybe. But the smell from broad beans and these field beans is absolutely delightful, gorgeous smell. And there's the comfrey alongside some grazing rye. So that's this perennial, it only grows during the summer, but every month or so we have to chop it off, and then that can either be used as compost material or as a mulch or made a liquid feed, and it's a potash accumulator, which is good for roots, comfrey. And a couple other examples of, well, that's mulching with cardboard, and then straw or hay on top of the card to make it look less ugly. And also an option in recycling terms, that's a woolen blanket, that will break down. So again, I'm trying to protect and keep the root zone of these fruit plants free of weeds, and in this case it's to allow them to regenerate. They've grown a bit, they've got overgrown with weeds, but this kind of mulching will take out all the weeds that would otherwise compete with those plants, and it will allow them to get re-established, have all this soil just to themselves, all the nutrients, all the water that year. Next year, once it gets re-established, I might not need to do that again. And here's the blackcurrant bed at Unston, and in this case we've mulched first with card and then with manure on top. And black currants, along with gooseberries and probably loganberries as well, they're heavy feeders. But that's what I was saying, if we put the mulch on early in the year, it's going to be 2 or 3 months for that to break down before it's actually required by the fruit when they want to swell up and then ripen. And by that stage, the mulch will actually have half disappeared, that kind of thing. And here's planting out, spacing, optimal planting pattern again. This is peppers with rows of front beans at the front actually. And just a few pictures illustrating planting a pepper. So here's to what I've done already. And this is the one that I'm going to plant. So they've been growing for about 3 months in the warm, started under lights, then they've lived in a greenhouse for maybe a month to get big enough, ready to plant out. First thing I'm doing is just moving stones and sticks out the way in a circle of soil where I'm going to plant, and then breaking up that soil. What I've actually found is if you start shallow, almost horizontal, and then you work your way down to vertical with your hand trowel, that's the easiest on your hand and your wrist. And again, it's one of these things, if you just do it once or twice, you wouldn't even notice that. But if you're doing it hundreds of times, you can get wrist strain. So that's to break up the soil where we're going to plant. And then that's moved, not into a pile, which is people's instinct again, but a little bit of this soil has been moved out all around in a circle around the planting hole. And also breaking up underneath where we're going to plant so that the roots can go down as well as sideways. And then making sure that there's enough space for the plant before knocking it out. Just pressing on the bottom to knock it out, holding it around the front, and then gently placing it on there and actually pressing it into the hole so that the roots get a good join with the new soil in the new place they're planted out. If you didn't press it, the roots might not be connected to that soil and it would take them longer to get established. And then bringing in soil in a circle around the plant and earthing up as much as it can handle, in this case up to the seed leaves, about 1 inch above where they've been growing so far. And then pressing that soil down, in this case, it's a big enough plant, I can use my whole body weight. And I'm pressing down 3 or 4 inches away from the plant and away from its roots, using my heel to actually firm it in. And the soil in this case is a buffer, so the pressure I'm putting on however many stone I am above ground is sponged by the soil, so that it's not that much pressure for the roots. It's just a good firm connection for the roots.
So you would be able to have crack with the soil before you respond, because if you did that on my allotments, it would just...
If you've still got clay and weeds, no, this is all it requires decent soil to do most of these things. And then when I water, I'm just pouring water into one place at the side of the plant, and that is naturally spreading around in a circle in the moat, but leaving the little mound where the plant is, and I've mounded the soil up around the stem, so that stays dry. And with some plants, like cucumbers especially, if the stem gets wet and stays wet and it's cold, it can rot through the stem and you lose your whole plant. So it's dry at the stem, wet, not where the current roots are, but slightly outside where the current roots are, again to encourage the next stage of rooting a bit further out. That leads on to, this is showing the raised beds used for irrigation. So this is actually rows of parsnips. They're 4 or 5 months old, they've got well established. So it's midsummer and they're getting a bit of a treat, which is, again, by hoeing, and again I describe it as soil sculpture. They've been earthed up as much as I can, and that leaves dips in between the rows where I can pour lots of water down. That water is going to penetrate down into the soil. Some of it will go sideways, so it will water and keep alive the plants immediately. But really I'm trying to water the side roots, the fibrous roots, deep down in the ground, not the actual plant itself. So whenever you're watering, think, where is the root system? I want to water the root system, not the plant. Some people I give a can to, and they think watering is like giving the plant a shower. And they pour it all over the leaves, but the leaves can't take in moisture. It's the roots deep down and further away from the plant which are actually going to do that job. Just to illustrate, that's the whole bed. And that's the benefit of having the raised beds on a level. So rather than running away from the crop, if the bed is fairly flat to start with, then I can actually direct water. And yeah, this kind of technique, irrigation, that's what you see on a big scale when people are doing fields, and a lot of the landscape is actually set up for distribution of water for irrigation, like huge tracts of land. And what we've got here, drainage. This was a one-off job. This lady had a very, very heavy clay soil, and it was waterlogged in the bottom of a dip, really. And we could have cut paths like this and kept them open, but she went for the option of this, which is drainage pipe. It's got hundreds of little holes in it, corrugated, so it allows water to seep into it, and then it flows away, but it doesn't get bogged up with mud. So that's cutting a drainage trench. Then the pipe was put into the drainage, into the trench, with a bit of soil on top of it. You can see the little holes there, and just that action of digging the trench dried out this soil above, and having this as a permanent solution along the path meant that she can now cultivate the beds, and they don't stay waterlogged. They're actually good for cultivation. But drainage as an absolute precursor to other things being able to grow. If you haven't got good drainage, it's hard. Now this is the polytunnel that I ran at Unston for about 10 years, and as I say, my preference was for hand watering. So these water butts here were filled up from the tap, and that was allowed to warm up for a day or two before we applied the water to the plants. And it's a minor point, but if you constantly water with tap water straight out the tap, that's 5, 10, 15 degrees colder than the ambient temperature of the soil and the plants. And every time you water with colder water like that, you're shocking them. And also, after I'd left, they got lazy and installed this, which is overhead irrigation. And that meant they got lax growth. They got growth on the plants, but it's much more likely that they get pests and diseases on those plants because the temptation is to use too much water. So, that was a backward step. But it is a complex question, and like I say, this first little drought in the year is just forewarning me that this is a preparation for the proper droughts that we're going to have in the main growing season. And then I'll need as much storage of water capacity as I can possibly get. So this is one system. These are in series. The water goes into one, then it pours into the next. There's all sorts of kind of fiddling around you have to do with water, but one recommendation is to try and store 2 or 3 days of your maximum water usage. So it depends how big your site is, but if you can store enough water to get by for half a week without having to refill them, that's what you're after. And my preference is I'll use I'll use rainwater up until I've used it all up, and then I will resort to tap water and refill the butts with tap water if I have to. But like I say, allowing it to stand for a couple of days, even outside, before it goes on the plants, then it's going on at the same ambient temperature as the plants and not chilling them. That's just an inlet for water collection system. And what we'll go next. And then back to planting out. This is putting peppers and tomatoes into these buckets again, and just showing when we water those, we're just watering the side of the bucket, and that floods around. Again, the plant is on a slight mound, so it's taking that good practice, and in this case applying it to a pot, mounding up around the stem, and we want the water to go around the edge to encourage the plant to grow out to the edge of the pot.
Is that their final position in that pot, or would you then plant them on?
No, they're big enough pots. One thing to say about that, these are florists' buckets. You can get them for about 10p each, and that is a restriction. For the peppers, it's about the right volume of soil for their root system. For the tomatoes, that's not enough. They could really do with double or treble or 10 times more. But we've compensated by putting extra concentrated fertiliser into that mixture. So the plant will still get all the nutrients it needs, even though it's got a restricted root system. But once, especially the tomatoes get growing, we can earth them up and mulch in the pot and put more soil into the pot, including extra fertiliser. And then these are the last few pictures for this week, but this is arranging a little flower bed, herb bed. And I don't make many kind of points about this, but I'm trying to put the taller plants in the middle or at the back, And as you come to the edge or the front of the bed, smaller and smaller plants. So there's things like alpine strawberries at the front, and this is actually monkshood at the back. So taller plants in the middle. And Simon and Ellie did that job, using plants that we'd grown on already. But once they knew that technique, and pressing down and forming the mound and the moat, mound and moat technique, they're able to get on with that pretty conscientiously. And yeah, this is earthing up celeriacs. So again, they're optimal planted. They've all got their own little space. They've grown for a couple of months. Now they're big enough to earth up again. So we're drawing more soil up around and covering up the celeriac, which, like the carrots, the more you cover it over, the harder it is for bugs to find it. And yeah, part of this is about once you've established decent techniques and shown them to people, then everyone can work on that system. So in terms of my social and therapeutic growing, working with lots of other people, as long as you've got some of these basic ideas, you know what's going on, and you can come to a site and you'd actually be responsible for it. So here we are hoeing, several people at once, hoeing in amongst the shallots, and again they can go sideways both ways or across the bed and keep them weed free. This is one Gail Griffiths from Sheffield Parks Department, and she's actually thinning the carrots. So too many carrots are growing at the moment. They're not competing too much, but from now on they'll be forming their roots. So we want to thin them out, take out maybe half or 2/3 of those carrots, so we get just fewer but decent size. In between the rows, we've got planks which are partly to stand on, to take the weight, but also acting as slug traps like we saw last week. And then this is a bit of a flash forward to a couple of weeks' time when we do fruit. But here's the root system of a little organically raised fruit tree. So it's a young plant, first year maiden whip, and just to show you the complexity of the root system, and I'll come back to this and repeat this in 2 weeks' time, but what we're trying to do when we plant out a fruit plant is re-establish this complex three-dimensional root system. So some of the roots are lower down, some of them are higher up, but when we plant it out, we want to re-establish it in the same three-dimensional pattern that it was in before in the nursery, which means there are different layers of roots. They all come out and in a radial and slightly downwards pattern from the central growing point. But I learnt root systems by planting things out, and sometimes by digging them up and actually examining what had happened. But that's the crucial point. The most important part of planting fruit is each one of those individual little roots is going to do a good job for the plant. But the problem is often people scrunch all the roots up and scrunch them together, and they're essentially acting just as one root then, and several of those roots will die off in the ground. So it's separating each little root both horizontally and creating this radial pattern, so they go out in a circle from the growing point in all directions in a circle. And that's just after we'd planted, that's probably the apricot down the Huerta actually. And in the first year, fruit wants to be kept weed free. Really, we want to cultivate fruit like a vegetable for about 5 years, until it gets to its full size, full stature, and then it's okay to allow weeds to compete with fruit. And actually that encourages fruiting at that stage by having the stress of weeds and turf growing next to a full-size tree. That triggers fruiting. It's a form of competition, a form of stress which encourages fruiting. In this case, the whole of what's going to be the root zone has been mulched with leaf mould. So we're still soil improving there, and that's what you want to do with your fruits against your fence. So that's a little bit thinking forwards to when we do fruit, and hopefully that way your fruit won't end up like this, which is a horrible bit of growth on a fruit tree. Most often fruit doesn't do well because it's not been well planted, and in this case this is an apple tree on a bush rootstock, a half-sized rootstock, and it's been left to grow a bit too complicated. So this is going around with the team after we'd done the Abundance project 3 or 4 years ago. Stephen Watts here encouraged us and set up pruning workshops where I was able to introduce people to complexities of pruning, which this, more than any of these other subjects which I've talked about, unless you actually do it, it's just a kind of theory, it's just on paper. But so giving people a bit of hands-on practice. And my final point tonight is, these are my system as well. Here's Gerald. He lives in an institutional care home, and it costs up to £3,000 a week to look after him. Can you believe it? And these are two of his carers who are paid just on minimum wages, so the managers can stay on the golf course. Bastard. Anyway, so these two are looking after him, but he is functioning in my system. He's helping me to helping to break seeds off of plants into a blanket. So Gerald is part of my system as well. And there's Lewis over at the Darnell Project. He's winnowing some seeds out of there. He wants to be an aeronautical engineer, but he likes coming to the allotment. And there's Greg and Dave threshing some of the rye, which is like they used to do all winter in the old days, just bashing bits of grain onto the ground so all the seed comes out onto a blanket, saving the rye. And then lunchtime, that's part of my system as well. This is the reward system. So it must be June, because we've got early potatoes, lettuces and peas, making my mouth water, bits of cauliflower, first courgettes. I use the courgettes instead of cucumbers because they come on a bit earlier than cucumbers, and they're just as nice as cucumbers. And the very first tomatoes. And then there's Mark with our pretend stall that we did at his project. But yeah, I'm bringing in the human element that, from the rest of society's point of view, I'm afraid these people are looked on as a burden. But if you give them the right context and you get the right techniques that they can join in with, they can be useful participating members of the growing culture. Thanks, folks. That'll do for tonight.
Thank you.
I've got one more next week. Excuse me. Yep. Next week, I will be doing this demonstration. But if you've got time, if you've got a spare hour, homework is to Google ediculture video on YouTube. So you can go in through YouTube or through Google. And there are 9 sections of the same session that I did last year, which was videoed. It will be slightly different this next week, and I'm hoping to spend more time on herbs. But if you can, find that on the internet, or get someone to find it for you, and if you can actually, it's a whole hour. If you look through that, you'll get a very in-depth description of growing media and how to do things like potting on. Like I say, I'll summarise that in a shorter demonstration next week, but I want to spend more time on herbs, herbalism, the medicinal benefits of herbs, and actually distributing these herbs to you next week. Hock it up.